Introduction to Book 3 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April Gonzalez. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, translated by Charles Johnston. Introduction to Book 3. The third book of Sutras is the book of spiritual powers. In considering these spiritual powers, two things must be understood and kept in memory. The first of these is this: these spiritual powers can only be gained when the development described in the first and second books has been measurably attained. When the commandments have been kept, the rules faithfully followed, and the experiences which are described have been passed through. For only after this is the spiritual man so far grown, so far disentangled from the psychical bandages and veils which have confined and blinded him, that he can use his proper powers and faculties. For this is the secret of all spiritual powers: they are in no sense an abnormal or supernatural overgrowth upon the material man, but are rather the powers and faculties inherent in the spiritual man, entirely natural to him, and coming naturally into activity, as the spiritual man is disentangled and liberated from the psychical bondage, through keeping the commandments and rules already set forth. As the personal man is the limitation and inversion of the spiritual man, all his faculties and powers are inversions of the powers of the spiritual man. In a single phrase, his self-seeking is the inversion of the self-seeking, which is the very being of the spiritual man, the ceaseless search after the divine and august self of all beings. This inversion is corrected by keeping the commandments and rules, and gradually, as the inversion is overcome, the spiritual man is extricated, and comes into possession and free exercise of his powers. The spiritual powers, therefore, are the powers of the grown and liberated spiritual man. They can only be developed and used as spiritual man grows and attains liberation through obedience. This is the first thing to be kept in mind in all that is said of spiritual powers in the third and fourth books of Sutras. The second thing to be understood and kept in mind is this: just as our modern sages have discerned and taught that all matter is ultimately one and eternal, definitely related throughout the whole wide universe, just as they have discerned and thought that all force is one and eternal, so coordinated throughout the whole universe, that whatever affects any atom measurably affects the whole boundless realm of matter and force, to the most distant star or nebula on the dim confines of space. So the ancient sages had discerned and taught that all consciousness is one, immortal, indivisible, infinite, so finely correlated and continuous that whatever is perceived by any consciousness is, whether actually or potentially, within the reach of all consciousness, and therefore within the reach of any consciousness. This has been well expressed by saying that all souls are fundamentally one with the Oversoul, that the Son of God and all sons of God are fundamentally one with the Father. When the consciousness is cleared of psychic bonds and veils, when the spiritual man is able to stand, to see, then this superb law comes into effect: whatever is within the knowledge of any consciousness, and this includes the whole infinite universe, is within his reach, and may, if he wills, be made a part of his consciousness. This he may attain through his fundamental unity with the Oversoul, raising himself toward the consciousness above him, and drawing on its resources. The Son, if he would work miracles, whether of perception or of action, must come often into the presence of the Father. This is the birthright of the spiritual man. Through it he comes into possession of his splendid and immortal powers. Let it be clearly kept in mind that what is here is to be related of the spiritual man, and his exalted powers must in no wise be detached from what has been gone before. The being, the very inception, of the spiritual man depends on the purification and moral attainment already detailed, and can in no wise dispense with these or curtail them. Let no one imagine that the true life, the true powers of the spiritual man can be attained by any way except the hard way of sacrifice, of trial, of renunciation, of selfless self-conquest and genuine devotion to the will of all others. Only thus can the golden gates be reached and entered. Only thus can we attain to the pure world wherein the spiritual man lives, and moves, and has his being. Nothing impure, nothing unholy can ever cross that threshold, least of all impure motives or self-seeking desires. These must be burnt away before an entrance to that world can be gained. But where there is light, there is shadow, and the lofty light of the soul casts upon the clouds of the mid-world of the shadow of the spiritual man and of his powers. The bastard vesture and bastard powers of psychism are easily attained, yet, even when attained, they are a delusion, the very essence of unreality. Therefore, ponder well the earlier rules, and lay a firm foundation of courage, sacrifice, selflessness, holiness. End of introduction to Book 3. Recording by April Gonzalez in Cavite, Philippines.
Book 3 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, translated by Charles Johnson. Book 3, 1-28. 1. The binding of the perceiving consciousness to a certain region is attention, dharana. Emerson quotes Sir Isaac Newton as saying that he made his great discoveries by intending his mind on them. That is what is meant here. I read the page of a book while thinking of something else. At the end of the page I have no idea what it is about, and read it again, still thinking of something else, with the same result. When I wake up, so to speak, make an effort of attention, fix my thought on what I am reading, and easily take in its meaning. The act of will, the effort of attention, the intending of the mind on each word and line of the page, just as the eyes are focused on each word and line, is the power here contemplated. It is the power to focus the consciousness on a given spot, and hold it there. Attention is the first and indispensable step in all knowledge. Attention to spiritual things is the first step to spiritual knowledge. 2. A prolonged holding of the perceiving consciousness in that region is meditation, dhyana. This will apply equally to outer and inner things. I may for a moment fix my attention on some visible object, a single penetrating glance, or I may hold the attention fixedly on it until it reveals far more of its nature than a single glance could perceive. The first is the focusing of the searchlight of consciousness upon the object. The other is the holding of the white beam of light steadily and persistently on the object, until it yields up the secret of its details. So for things within, one may fix the inner glance for a moment on spiritual things, or one may hold the consciousness steadily upon them, until what was in the dark slowly comes forth into the light, and yields up its immortal secret. But this is possible only for the spiritual man, after the commandments and the rules have been kept. For until this is done, the thronging storms of psychical thoughts dissipate and distract the attention, so that it will not remain fixed on spiritual things. The cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, choke the word of the spiritual message. 3. When perceiving consciousness in this meditative is wholly given to illuminating the essential meaning of the object contemplated, and is freed from the sense of separateness and personality, this is contemplation, samadhi. Let us review the steps so far taken. First, the beam of perceiving consciousness is focused on a certain region or subject, through the effort of attention. Then this attending consciousness is held on its object. Third is the ardent will to know its meaning, to illumine it with comprehending thought. Fourth, all personal bias, all desire merely to endorse a previous opinion and so to prove oneself right, and all desire for personal profit or gratification must be quite put away. There must be a purely disinterested love of truth for its own sake. This is the perceiving consciousness made void, as it were, of all personality or sense of separateness. The personal limitation stands aside and lets the all-consciousness come to bear upon the problem. The Oversoul bends its ray upon the object and illumines it with pure light. 4. When these three, attention, meditation, contemplation, are exercised at once, this is perfectly concentrated meditation, sanyama. When the personal limitation of the perceiving consciousness stands aside and allows the all-conscious to come to bear upon the problem, then arises that real knowledge which is called a flash of genius, that real knowledge which makes discoveries, and without which no discovery can be made, however painstaking the effort. For genius is the vision of the spiritual man, and that vision is a question of growth rather than present effort, though right effort, rightly continued, will in time infallibly lead to growth and vision. Through the power thus to set aside personal limitation, to push aside petty concerns and cares, and steady the whole nature and will in an ardent love of truth and desire to know it, through the power thus to make way for the all-consciousness, all great men make their discoveries. Newton, watching the apple fall to the earth, was able to look beyond, to see the subtle waves of force pulsating through apples, worlds, and suns and galaxies, and thus to perceive universal gravitation. The Oversoul, looking through his eyes, recognized the universal force, one of its own children. Darwin, watching the forms and motions of plants and animals, let the same august consciousness come to bear on them, and saw infinite growth perfected through ceaseless struggle. He perceived the superb process of evolution, the Oversoul once more recognizing its own. Fraunhofer, noting the dark lines in the band of sunlight in his spectroscope, divined their identity with the bright lines in the spectra of incandescent iron, sodium, and the rest, and so saw the oneness of substance in the worlds and suns, the unity of the materials of the universe. Once again the Oversoul, looking with his eyes, recognized its own. So it is with all true knowledge, but the mind must transcend its limitations, its idiosyncrasies. There must be purity, for to the pure in heart is the promise that they shall see God. 5. By mastering this perfectly concentrated meditation, there comes the illumination of perception. The meaning of this is illustrated by what has been said before. When the spiritual man is able to throw aside the trammels of emotional and mental limitation, and to open his eyes, he sees clearly, he attains to illuminated perception. A poet once said that occultism is the conscious cultivation of genius, and it is certain that the awakened spiritual man attains to the perceptions of genius. Genius is the vision, the power of the spiritual man, whether its possessor recognizes this or not. All true knowledge is of the spiritual man. The greatest in all ages have recognized this and put their testimony on record. The great in wisdom who have not consciously recognized it have ever been full of the spirit of reverence, of selfless devotion to truth, of humility, as was Darwin. And reverence and humility are the unconscious recognition of the nearness of the Spirit, that divinity which broods over us, a master or slave. 6. This power is distributed in ascending degrees. It is to be attained step by step. It is a question, not of miracle, but of evolution, of growth. Newton had to master the multiplication table, then the 4 rules of arithmetic, then the rudiments of algebra, before he came to the binomial theorem. At each point there was attention, concentration, insight. Until these were attained, no progress to the next point was possible. So with Darwin. He had to learn the form and use of leaf and flower, of bone and muscle, the characteristics of genera and species, the distribution of plants and animals, before he had in mind that nexus of knowledge on which the light of his great idea was at last able to shine. So it is with all knowledge, so it is with spiritual knowledge. Take the matter this way. The first subject for the exercise of my spiritual insight is my day, with its circumstances, its hindrances, its opportunities, its duties. I do what I can to solve it, to fulfill its duties, to learn its lessons. I try to live my day with aspiration and faith. That is the first step. By doing this I gather a harvest for the evening. I gain a deeper insight into life, in virtue of which I begin the next day with a certain advantage, a certain spiritual advance and attainment. So with all successive days. In faith and aspiration we pass from day to day, in growing knowledge and power, with never more than one day to solve at a time, until all life becomes radiant and transparent. 7. This threefold power, of attention, meditation, contemplation, is more interior than the means of growth previously described. Very naturally so, because the means of growth previously described were concerned with the extrication of the spiritual man from psychic bondage and veils, while this threefold power is to be exercised by the spiritual man thus extricated and standing on his feet, viewing life with open eyes. 8. But this triad is still exterior to the soul vision which is unconditioned, free from the seed of mental analysis. The reason is this. The threefold power we have been considering, the triad of attention, contemplation, meditation, is, so far as we have yet considered it, the focusing of the beam of perceiving consciousness upon some form of manifesting being, with the view of understanding it completely. There is a higher stage, where the beam of consciousness is turned back upon itself, and the individual consciousness enters into and knows the all-consciousness. This is a being in immortality rather than knowing. It is free from mental analysis or mental forms. It is not an activity of the higher mind, even the mind of the spiritual man. It is an activity of the soul. Had Newton risen to this higher stage, he would have known, not the laws of motion, but that of high being, from whose life comes eternal motion. Had Darwin risen to this, he would have seen the soul, whose graduated thought and being all evolution expresses. There are therefore these two perceptions, that of living things and that of the life, that of the soul's works and that of the soul itself. 9. One of the ascending degrees is the development of control. First there is the overcoming of mind impress of excitation. Then comes the manifestation of the mind press of control. Then the perceiving consciousness follows after the moment of control. This is the development of control. The meaning seems to be this. Some object enters the field of observation, and at first violently excites the mind, stirring up curiosity, fear, wonder. Then the consciousness returns upon itself, as it were, and takes the perception firmly in hand, steadying itself, and viewing the matter calmly from above. This steadying effort of the will upon the perceiving consciousness is control, and immediately upon it follows perception, understanding, insight. Take a trite example. Supposing someone is walking in an Indian forest. A charging elephant suddenly appears. The man is excited by astonishment, and perhaps terror. But he exercises an effort of will, perceives the situation in its true bearings, and recognizes that a certain thing must be done, in this case probably that he must get out of the way as quickly as possible. Or a comet, unheralded, appears in the sky like a flaming sword. The beholder is at first astonished, perhaps terror-stricken, but he takes himself in hand, controls his thoughts, views the apparition calmly, and finally calculates its orbit and its relation to meteor showers. These are extreme illustrations, but with all knowledge the order of perception is the same. First the excitation of the mind by the new object impressed on it, then the control of the mind from within, upon which follows the perception of the nature of the object. Where the eyes of the spiritual man are open, this will be a true and penetrating spiritual perception. In some such way do our living experience come to us, first with a shock of pain, then the soul steadies itself and controls the pain, then the spirit perceives the lessons of the event, and its bearing upon the progressive revelation of life. 10. Through frequent repetition of this process the mind becomes habituated to it, and there arises an equitable flow of perceiving consciousness. Control of the mind by the soul, like control of the muscles by the mind, comes by practice and constant voluntary repetition. As an example of control of the muscles by the mind, take the ceaseless practice by which a musician gains mastery over his instrument, or a fencer gains skill with a rapier. Innumerable small efforts of attention will make a result which seems well nigh miraculous, which for the novice is really miraculous. Then consider that far more wonderful instrument, the perceiving mind, played on by that fine musician, the soul. Here again innumerable small efforts of attention will accumulate into mastery, and a mastery worth winning. For a concrete example, take the gradual conquest of each day, and the effort to live that day for the soul. To him that is faithful unto death, the Master gives the crown of life. 11. The gradual conquest of the mind's tendency to flit from one object to another, and the power of one-pointedness, make the development of contemplation. As an illustration of the mind's tendency to flit from one object to another, take a small boy learning arithmetic. He begins, 2 ones are 2, 3 ones are 3, and then he thinks of 3 coins in his pocket, which will purchase so much candy in the store down the street, next to the toy shop, where are baseballs, marbles, and so on. Then he comes back with a jerk, 2, 4 ones are 4. So with us also. We are seeking the meaning of our task, but the mind takes advantage of a moment of slackened attention, and flits off from one frivolous detail to another, till we suddenly come back to consciousness after traversing leagues of space. We must learn to conquer this, and to go back within ourselves into the beam of perceiving consciousness itself, which is a beam of the Oversoul. This is the true one-pointedness, the bringing of our consciousness into a focus in the soul. 12. When following this, the controlled manifold tendency and the aroused one-pointedness are equally balanced of the perceiving consciousness, is the development of one-pointedness. This would seem to mean that the insight which is called one-pointedness has 2 sides, equally balanced. There is, first, the manifold aspect of any object, the sum of all its characteristics and properties. This must be held firmly in the mind. Then there is the perception of the object as a unity, as a whole, the perception of its essence. First the details must be clearly perceived, then the essence must be comprehended. For the 2 processes are equally balanced, the true one-pointedness is attained. Everything has these 2 sides, the side of difference and the side of unity. There is the individual and there is the genus, the pole of matter and diversity, and the pole of oneness and spirit. To see the object truly, we must see both. 13. Through this, the inherent character, distinctive marks and conditions of being and powers, according to their development, are made clear. By the power defined in the preceding sutra, the inherent character, distinctive marks and conditions of beings and powers are made clear. For through this power, as defined, we get a 2-fold view of each object, seeing at once all its individual characteristics and its essential character, species and genus. We see it in relation to itself, and in relation to the eternal. Thus we see a rose as that particular flower, with its color and scent, its peculiar fold of each petal. But we also see it in the species, the family to which it belongs, with its relation to all plants, to all life, to life itself. So in any day we see the events and circumstances, we also see it in the lesson set for the soul by the Eternal. 14. Every object has its characteristics which are already quiescent, those which are active, and those which are yet not definable. Every object has characteristics belonging to its past, its present, and its future. In a fir tree, for example, there are stumps or scars of dead branches, which once represented its foremost growth. There are the branches with their needles spread out into the air. There are the buds at the end of each branch and twig, which carry the still closely packed needles which are the promise of the future. In like manner, the chrysalis has, as its past, the caterpillar; as its future, the butterfly. The man has, in his past, the animal; in his future, the angel. Both are visible even now in his face. So with all things, for all things change and grow. 15. Difference in stage is the cause of difference in development, but this amplifies what has just been said. The first stage is the sapling, the caterpillar, the animal. The second stage is the growing tree, the chrysalis, the man. The third is the splendid pine, the butterfly, the angel. Difference of stage is the cause of difference of development, so it is among men and among the races of men. 16. Through perfectly concentrated meditation on the three stages of development comes a knowledge of past and future. We have taken our illustrations from natural science because, since every true discovery in natural science is a divination of law and nature, attained through a flash of genius, such discoveries really represent acts of spiritual perception, acts of perception by the spiritual man, even though they are generally not so recognized. So we may once more use the same illustration. Perfectly concentrated meditation, perfect insight into the chrysalis, reveals the caterpillar that has been, the butterfly that it is destined to be. He who knows the seed pod, or ear it has come from, and the plant that is to come from it. So in like manner, he who really knows today, and the heart of today, knows its parent yesterday and its child tomorrow. Past, present, and future are all in the eternal. He who dwells in the eternal knows all three. 17. The sound and the object and the thought called up by a word are confounded because they are all blurred together in the mind. By perfectly concentrated meditation on the distinction between them, there comes an understanding of the sounds uttered by all beings. It must be remembered that we are speaking of perception by the spiritual man. Sound, like every force, is the expression of a power of the eternal. Infinite shades of this power are expressed in the infinitely varied tones of sound. He who having entry into the consciousness of the eternal knows the essence of this power, can divine the meaning of all sounds, from the voice of the insect to the music of the spheres. In a like manner, he who has attained to spiritual vision can perceive the mind images in the thoughts of others, with the shade of feeling which goes with them, thus reading their thoughts as easily as he hears their words. Everyone has the germ of this power, since difference of tone will give widely differing meanings to the same words, meanings which are intuitively perceived by everyone. 18. When the mind impressions become visible, there comes an understanding of previous births. This is simple enough if we grasp the truth of rebirth. The fine harvest of past experiences is drawn into the spiritual nature, forming indeed the basis of its development. When the consciousness has been raised to a point above these fine subjective impressions, and can look down upon them from above, this will in itself be a remembering of past births. 19. By perfectly concentrated meditation on mind images is gained the understanding of the thoughts of others. Here, for those who can profit by it, is the secret of thought reading. Take the simplest case of intentional thought transference. It is the testimony of those who have done this that the perceiving mind must be stilled, before the mind image projected by the other mind can be seen. With it comes a sense of the feeling and temper of the other mind, and so on, in higher degrees. 20. But since that on which the thought of the mind of another rests is not objective to the thought reader's consciousness, he perceives the thought only, and not also that on which the thought rests. The meaning appears to be simple. One may be able to perceive the thoughts of some one at a distance. One cannot, by that means alone, also perceive the external surroundings of that person which arouse these thoughts. 21. By perfectly concentrated meditation on the form of the body, by arresting the body's perceptibility, and by inhibiting the eye's power of sight, there comes the power to make the body invisible. There are many instances of the exercise of this power by mesmerists, hypnotists, and the like, and we may simply call it an instance of the power of suggestion. Shankara tells us that by this power the popular magicians of the East perform their wonders, working on the mind images of others while remaining invisible themselves. It is all a question of being able to see and control the mind images. 22. The works which will fill out the lifespan may be either immediately or gradually operative. By perfectly concentrated meditation on these comes a knowledge of the time of the end, as also through signs. A garment which is wet, says the commentator, may be hung up to dry, and so dry rapidly, or it may be rolled in a ball and dry slowly. So a fire may blaze or smolder. Thus it is with karma, the works that fill out the lifespan. By an insight into the mental forms and forces which make up karma, there comes a knowledge of the rapidity or slowness of their development, and of the time when the debt will be paid. 23. By perfectly concentrated meditation on sympathy, compassion, and kindness is gained the power of interior union with others. Unity is the reality, separateness the illusion. The nearer we come to reality, the nearer we come to unity of heart. Sympathy, compassion, kindness are modes of this unity of heart, whereby we rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. These things are learned by desiring to learn them. 24. By perfectly concentrated meditation on power, even such power as that of the elephant may be gained. This is a pretty image. Elephants possess not only force, but poise and fineness of control. They can lift a straw, a child, a tree, with perfectly judged control and effort. So the simile is a good one. By detachment, by withdrawing into the soul's reservoir of power, we can gain all these, force and fineness and poise, the ability to handle with equal mastery all things small and great, concrete and abstract alike. 25. By bending upon them the awakened inner light, there comes a knowledge of things subtle, or concealed, or obscure. As was said at the outset, each consciousness is related to all consciousness, and through it has a potential consciousness of all things, whether subtle, or concealed, or obscure. An understanding of this great truth will come with practice. As one of the wise has said, we have no conception of the power of meditation. 26. By perfectly concentrated meditation on the sun comes a knowledge of the worlds. This has several meanings. First, by a knowledge of the constitution of the sun, astronomers can understand the kindred nature of the stars, and it is said there is a finer astronomy, where the spiritual man is the astronomer. But the sun also means the soul, and through knowledge of the soul comes a knowledge of the realms of life. 27. By perfectly concentrated meditation on the moon comes a knowledge of the lunar mansions. Here again are different meanings. The moon is, first, the companion planet, which each day passes backward through one mansion of the stars. By watching the moon, the boundaries of the mansion are learned, with their succession in the great time dial of the sky. But the moon also symbolizes the analytic mind, with its divided realms, and these too may be understood through perfectly concentrated meditation. 28. By perfectly concentrated meditation on the fixed pole star comes a knowledge of the motion of the stars. Addressing duty, stern daughter of the voice of God, Wordsworth finely said, "Thou cost preserve the stars from wrong, and the most ancient heavens through thee are fresh and strong," thus suggesting a profound relation between the moral powers and the powers that rule the worlds. So in this sutra, the fixed pole star is the eternal spirit about which all things move, as well as the star toward which points the axis of the earth. Deep mysteries attend both, and the veil of mystery is only to be raised by meditation, by open-eyed vision of the awakened spiritual man. End of Book 3, 1 through 28. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. VoiceOversByKirk.com. Book 3 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Translated by Charles Johnson. Book 3, 29 through 55. 29. Perfectly concentrated meditation on the center of force in the lower trunk brings an understanding of the order of the bodily powers. We are coming to a vitally important part of the teaching of yoga, namely, the spiritual man's attainment of full self-consciousness, the awakening of the spiritual man as a self-conscious individual, behind and above the natural man. In this awakening, and in the process of gestation which precedes it, there is a close relation with the powers of the natural man, which are, in a certain sense, the projection, outward and downward, of the powers of the spiritual man. This is notably true of that creative power of the spiritual man which, when embodied in the natural man, becomes the power of generation. Not only is this power the cause of the continuance of the bodily race of mankind, but further, in the individual, it is the key to the dominance of personal life. Rising, as it were, through the life channels of the body, it flushes the personality with physical force, and maintains and colors the illusion that the physical life is the dominant and all-important expression of life. In due time, when the spiritual man has begun to take form, the creative force will be drawn off, and become operative in building the body of the spiritual man, just as it has been operative in the building of physical bodies, through generation in the natural world. Perfectly concentrated meditation on the nature of this force means, first, that rising of the consciousness into the spiritual world, already described, which gives the one sure foothold for meditation, and then, from that spiritual point of vantage, not only an insight into the creative force, in its spiritual and physical aspects, but also a gradually attained control of this wonderful force, which will mean its direction to the body of the spiritual man, and its gradual withdrawal from the body of the natural man, until the overpressure, so general and such a fruitful source of misery in our day, is abated, and purity takes the place of passion. This overpressure, which is the cause of so many evils and so much of human shame, is an abnormal, not a natural condition. It is primarily due to the spiritual blindness, to blindness regarding the spiritual man, and ignorance even of his existence. For by this blind ignorance are closed the channels through which, were they open, the creative force could flow into the body of the spiritual man, there building up an immortal vesture. There is no cure for blindness, with its consequent overpressure and attendant misery and shame, but spiritual vision, spiritual aspiration, sacrifice, the new birth from above. There is no other way to lighten the burden, to lift the misery and shame from human life. Therefore, let us follow after sacrifice and aspiration. Let us seek the light. In this way only shall we gain that insight into the order of bodily powers, and that mastery of them which this sutra implies. 30. By perfectly concentrated meditation on the center of force in the well of the throat, there comes the cessation of hunger and thirst. We are continuing the study of the bodily powers and centers of force in their relation to the powers and forces of the spiritual man. We have already considered the dominant power of physical life, the creative power which secures the continuance of physical life, and further, the manner in which, through aspiration and sacrifice, it is gradually raised and set to the work of upbuilding the body of the spiritual man. We now come to the dominant psychic force, the power which manifests itself in speech, and in virtue of which the voice may carry so much of the personal magnetism, endowing the orator with a tongue of fire, magical in its power to arouse and rule the emotions of his hearers. This emotional power, this distinctively psychical force, is the cause of hunger and thirst, the psychical hunger and thirst for sensations, which is the source of our two-sided life of emotionalism, with its hopes and fears, its expectations and memories, its desires and hates. The source of this psychical power, or perhaps we should say, its center of activity in the physical body, is said to be in the cavity of the throat. Thus in the Taittiriya Upanishad it is written, "There is this shining ether in the inner being. Therein is the spiritual man, formed through thought, immortal, golden. Inward in the palate, the organ that hangs down like a nipple, this is the womb of Indra, and there where the dividing of the hair turns, extending upward to the crown of the head." Indra is the name given to the creative power of which we have spoken, and which, we are told, resides in the organ which hangs down like a nipple, inward in the palate. 31. By perfectly concentrated meditation on the center of force in the channel called tortoise-formed, comes steadfastness. We are concerned now with the center of the nervous or psychical force below the cavity of the throat, in the chest, in which is felt the sensation of fear. The center, the disturbance of which sets the heart beating miserably with dread, or which produces that sense of terror through which the heart is said to stand still. When the truth concerning fear is thoroughly mastered, through spiritual insight into the immortal fearless life, then this force is perfectly controlled. There is no more fear. Just as through the control of the psychic power which works through the nerve center in the throat, there comes a cessation of hunger and thirst. Thereafter, these forces, or their spiritual prototypes, are turned to the building of the spiritual man. Always it must be remembered, the victory is first a spiritual one, only later does it bring control of the bodily powers. 32. Through perfectly concentrated meditation on the light in the head comes the vision of the masters who have attained. The tradition is that there is a certain center of force in the head, perhaps the pineal gland, which some of our Western philosophers have supposed to be the dwelling of the soul, a center which is, as it were, a doorway between the natural and the spiritual man. It is the seat of that better and wiser consciousness behind the outward-looking consciousness in the forward part of the head, and that better and wiser consciousness in the back of the mind, which views spiritual things, and seeks to impress the spiritual view on the outward-looking consciousness in the forward part of the head. It is the spiritual man seeking to guide the natural man, seeking to bring the natural man to concern himself with the things of his immortality. This is suggested in the words of the Upanishad already quoted. There where the dividing of the hair turns, extending upward to the crown of the head. All of which may sound very fantastical, until one comes to understand it. It is said that when this power is fully awakened, it brings a vision of the great companions of spiritual man, those who have already attained, crossing over to the further shore of the sea of death and rebirth. Perhaps it is to this divine sight that the Master alluded, who is reported to have said, "I counsel you to buy of me eye salve, that you may see." It is of this same vision of the great companions, the children of light, that a seer wrote, "Though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea, which brought us hither, can in a moment travel thither, and see the children sport upon the shore, and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore." 33. Or through the divining power of tuition he knows all things. This is really the supplement, the spiritual side of the sutra just translated. Step by step, as the better consciousness, the spiritual view, gains force in the back of the mind, so in the same measure, the spiritual man is gaining the power to see, learning to open the spiritual eyes. When the eyes are fully opened, the spiritual man beholds the great companions standing about him. He has begun to know all things. This divining power of intuition is the power which lies above and behind the so-called rational mind. The rational mind formulates a question and lays it before the intuition, which gives a real answer, often immediately distorted by the rational mind, yet always embodying a kernel of truth. By this process, through which the rational mind brings questions to the intuition for a solution, that the truths of science are reached, the flashes of discovery and genius. But this higher power need not work in subordination to the so-called rational mind. It may act directly, as full illumination, the vision and the faculty divine. 34. By perfectly concentrated meditation on the heart, the interior being, comes the knowledge of consciousness. The heart here seems to mean, as it so often does in the Upanishads, the interior spiritual nature, the consciousness of the spiritual man, which is related to the heart and to the wisdom of the heart. By steadily seeking after, and finding, the consciousness of the spiritual man, by coming to consciousness as the spiritual man, a perfect knowledge of consciousness will be attained. For the consciousness of the spiritual man has this divine quality: while being and remaining a truly individual consciousness, it at the same time flows over, as it were, and blends with the divine consciousness above and about it, the consciousness of the great companions, and by showing itself to be one with the divine consciousness, it reveals the nature of all consciousness, the secret that all consciousness is one and divine. 35. The personal self seeks to feast on life, through a failure to perceive the distinction between the personal self and the spiritual man. All personal experience really exists for the sake of another, namely, the spiritual man. By perfectly concentrated meditation on experience for the sake of the self, comes a knowledge of the spiritual man. The divine ray of the higher self, which is eternal, impersonal and abstract, descends into life, and forms a personality which, through the stress and storm of life, is hammered into a definite and concrete self-conscious individuality. The problem is to blend these two powers, taking the eternal and the spiritual being of the first, and blending with it, transferring into it, the self-conscious individuality of the second, and thus bringing to life a third being, the spiritual man, who is heir to the immortality of his father, the higher self, and yet has the self-conscious, concrete individuality of his other parent, the personal self. This is the true Immaculate Conception, the new birth from above, conceived of the Holy Spirit. Of this new birth it is said, "That which is born of the Spirit is spirit, ye must be born again." Rightly understood, therefore, the whole life of the personal man is for another, not for himself. He exists only to render his very life and all his experience for the building up of the spiritual man. Only through failure to see this does he seek enjoyment for himself, seek to secure the feasts of life for himself, not understanding that he must live for the other, live sacrificially, offering both feasts and his very being on the altar, giving himself as a contribution for the building of the spiritual man. When he does understand this, and lives for the higher self, setting his heart and thought upon the higher self, then his sacrifice bears divine fruit, the spiritual man is built up, consciousness awakes in him, and he comes fully into being as a divine and immortal individuality. 36. Thereupon are born the divine power of intuition, and the hearing, the touch, the vision, the taste, and the power of smell of the spiritual man. When in virtue of the perpetual sacrifice of the personal man, daily and hourly giving his life for his divine brother the spiritual man, and through the radiance ever pouring down from the higher self, eternal in the heavens, the spiritual man comes to birth. There awake in him those powers, those physical counterparts we know in the personal man. The spiritual man begins to see, to hear, to touch, to taste, and besides the senses of the spiritual man, there awakes in his mind that divine counterpart of the mind of the physical man, the power of direct and immediate knowledge, the power of spiritual intuition, of divination. This power, as we have seen, owes its virtue to the unity, the continuity of consciousness, whereby whatever is known to any consciousness is knowable by any other consciousness. Thus the consciousness of the spiritual man, who lives above our narrow barriers of separateness, is in intimate touch with the consciousness of the great companions, and can draw on that vast reservoir for all real needs. Thus arises within the spiritual man that certain knowledge which is called intuition, divination, illumination. 37. These powers stand in contradistinction to the highest spiritual vision. In manifestation they are called magical powers. The divine man is destined to supersede the spiritual man, as the spiritual man supersedes the natural man. Then the disciple becomes a master. The open powers of the spiritual man, spiritual vision, hearing, and touch stand, therefore, in contradistinction to the higher divine power above them, and must in no wise be regarded as the end of the way, for the path has no end, but rises ever to higher and higher glories. The soul's growth and splendor have no limit. So that, if the spiritual powers we have been considering are regarded as in any sense final, they are a hindrance, a barrier to the far higher powers of the divine man. But viewed from below, from the standpoint of normal physical experience, they are powers truly magical, as the powers natural to a four-dimensional being will appear magical to a three-dimensional being. 38. Through the weakening of the causes of bondage, and by learning the method of sassing, the consciousness is transferred to the other body. In due time, after the spiritual man has formed and grown stable through the forces and virtues already enumerated, and after the senses of the spiritual man have awakened, there comes the transfer of the dominant consciousness, the sense of individuality, from the physical to the spiritual man. Thereafter, the physical man is felt to be secondary, a subordinate, an instrument through whom the spiritual man works. And the spiritual man is felt to be the real individuality. This is, in a sense, the attainment to full salvation and immortal life, yet it is not the final goal or resting place, but only the beginning of the greater way. The means for this transfer are described as the weakening of the causes of bondage, and an understanding of the method of passing from one consciousness to the other. The first may be also described as detachment, and comes from the conquest of the delusion that the personal self is the real man. When that delusion abates and is held in check, the finer consciousness of the spiritual man begins to shine in the background of the mind. The transfer of the sense of individuality to this finer consciousness, and thus to the spiritual man, then becomes a matter of recollection, of attention, primarily a matter of taking in a deeper interest in the life and doings of the spiritual man, than in the pleasures or occupations of the personality. Therefore it is said, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust cloth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, and neither moth nor rust cloth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through, nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." 39. Through mastery of the upward life comes freedom from the dangers of water, morass, and thorny places, and the power of ascension is gained. Here is one of the sentences so characteristic of this author, and indeed of the Eastern spirit, in which there is an obvious exterior meaning, and, within this, a clear interior meaning, not quite so obvious, but far more vital. The surface meaning is, that by mastery of a certain power, called here the upward life, and akin to levitation, there comes the ability to walk on water, or to pass over thorny places without wounding the feet. But there is a deeper meaning. When we speak of the disciple's path as a path of thorns, we use a symbol, and the same symbol is used here. The upward life means something more than the power. often manifested in abnormal psychical experiences, of levitating the physical body or nearby physical objects. It means the strong power of aspiration, of upward will, which first builds, then awakes the spiritual man, and finally transfers the conscious individuality to him, for it is he who passes safely over the waters of death and rebirth, and is not pierced by the thorns in the path. Therefore it is said that he who would tread the path of power must look for a home in the air, and afterwards in the ether. Of the upward life, this is written in the Katha Upanishad. 101 are the heart's channels. Of these one passes to the crown. Going up this, he comes to the immortal. This is the power of ascension spoken of in the Sutra. 40. By mastery of the binding life comes radiance. The Upanishads, it is said that this binding life unites the upward life to the downward life, and these lives have their analogies in the vital breaths in the body. The thought in the text seems to be that, when the personality is brought thoroughly under control of the spiritual man, through the life currents which bind them together, the personality is endowed with a new force, a strong personal magnetism, one might call it, such as is often an appanage of genius. But the text seems to mean more than this, and to have in view the vesture of the color of the sun, attributed by the Upanishads to the spiritual man, that vesture which a disciple has thus described. The Lord shall change our vile body, that it may be fashioned like unto his glorious body. Perhaps body of radiance would better translate the Greek. In both these passages the teaching seems to be that the body of the full-grown spiritual man is radiant or luminous, for those at least who have anointed their eyes with eye salve, so that they see. 41. From perfectly concentrated meditation on the correlation of hearing and the ether comes the power of spiritual hearing. Physical sound, we are told, is carried by the air, or by water, iron, or some medium on the same plane of substance. But then is a finer hearing, whose medium of transmission would seem to be the ether, perhaps not that ether which carries light, heat, and magnetic waves, but it may be the far finer ether through which the power of gravity works. For while light, or heat, or magnetic waves, traveling from the sun to the earth, take 8 minutes for the journey, it is mathematically certain that the pull of gravity does not take as much as 8 seconds, or even an eighth of a second. The pull of gravity travels, it would seem, as quick as thought. So it may well be that, in thought transference or telepathy, the thoughts travel by the same way, carried by the same thought-swift medium. The transfer of a word by telepathy is the simplest and earliest form of the divine hearing of the spiritual man. As that power grows, and as, through perfectly concentrated meditation, the spiritual man comes into more complete mastery of it, he grows able to hear and clearly distinguish the speech of the great companions, whose counsel and comfort him on his way. They may speak to him either in wordless thoughts or in perfectly definite words and sentences. 42. By perfectly concentrated meditation on the correlation of the body with the ether, and by thinking of it as light as thistledown, will come the power to traverse the ether. It has been said that he who would tread the path of power must look for a home in the air, and afterwards in the ether. This would seem to mean, besides the constant injunction to detachment, that he must be prepared to inhabit at first a psychic and then an etheric body, the former being the body of dreams, the latter the body of the spiritual man, when he wakes up on the other side of dreamland. The gradual accustoming to the consciousness of this new etheric vesture, its gradual acclimatization, so to speak, in the etheric body of the spiritual man, is what our text seems to contemplate. 43. When that condition of consciousness is reached, which is far-reaching and not confined to the body, which is outside the body and not conditioned by it, then the veil which conceals the light is torn away. Perhaps the best comment on this is afforded by the words of Paul. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago. Whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such a one caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth, how that he was caught up into paradise, and heard unspeakable or unspoken words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. The condition is, briefly, that the awakened spiritual man who sees and hears beyond the veil. 44. Mastery of the elements comes from perfectly concentrated meditation on their five forms: the gross, the elemental, the subtle, the inherent, the purposive. These five forms are analogous to those recognized by modern physics: solid, liquid, gaseous, radiant, and ionic. When the piercing vision of the awakened spiritual man is directed to the forms of matter, from within, as it were, from behind the scenes, then perfect mastery over the beggarly elements is attained. This is, perhaps, equivalent to the injunction, "Inquire of the earth, the air, and the water, of the secrets they hold for you." The development of your inner senses will enable you to do this. 45. Thereupon will come the manifestation of the atomic and other powers which are the endowment of the body, together with its unassailable force. The body in question is, of course, the etheric body of the spiritual man. He is said to possess 8 powers: the atomic, the power of assimilating himself with the nature of the atom, which will perhaps involve the power to disintegrate material forms; the power of levitation; the power of limitless extension; the power of boundless reach, so that, as the commentator says, he can touch the moon with the tip of his finger; the power to accomplish his will; the power of gravitation; the correlative of levitation; the power of command; the power of creative will. These are the endowments of the spiritual man. Further, the spiritual body is unassailable. Fire burns it not, water wets it not, the sword cleaves it not, dry winds parch it not. And, it is said, the spiritual man can impart something of this quality and temper to his bodily vesture. 46. Shapeliness, beauty, force, the temper of the diamond. These are the endowments of that body. The spiritual man is shapely, beautiful, strong, firm as the diamond. Therefore it is written, "These things saith the Son of God, who hath his eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. He that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, and I will give him the morning star." 47. Mastery over the powers of perception and action come through perfectly concentrated meditation on their fivefold forms, namely, their power to grasp their distinctive nature, the element of self-consciousness in them, their inherence, and their purposiveness. Take, for example, sight. This possesses, first, the power to grasp, apprehend, perceive. Second, it has its distinctive form of perception, that is, visual perception. Third, it always carries with its operations self-consciousness, the thought, "I perceive." Fourth, sight has the power of extension through the whole field of vision, even to the utmost star. Fifth, it is used for the purposes of the seer. So with the other senses. Perfectly concentrated meditation on each sense, of viewing it from behind and within, as is possible for the spiritual man, brings a mastery of the scope and true character of each sense, and of the world on which they report collectively. 48. Thence comes the power shift as thought, independent of instruments, and the mastery over matter. We are further enumerating the endowments of the spiritual man. Among these is the power to traverse space with the swiftness of thought, so that whatever place the spiritual man thinks of, to that he goes. In that place he already is. Thought has now become his means of locomotion. He is therefore independent of instruments, and can bring this force to bear directly wherever he wills. 49. When the spiritual man is perfectly disentangled from the psychic body, he attains to a mastery over all things, and to a knowledge of all. The spiritual man is enmeshed in a web of the emotions, desire, fear, ambition, passion, and impeded by the mental forms of separateness and materialism. When these meshes are sundered, these obstacles completely overcome, then the spiritual man stands forth on his own wide world, strong, mighty, wise. He uses divine powers with a divine scope and energy, working together with divine companions. To such a one it is said, "Thou art now a disciple, able to stand, able to hear, able to see, able to speak. Thou hast conquered desire and attained to self-knowledge. Thou hast seen thy soul in its bloom and recognized it, and heard the voice of the silence." 50. By absence of all self-indulgence at this point, when the seeds of bondage to sow are destroyed, pure spiritual being is attained. The seeking of indulgence for the personal self, whether through passion or ambition, sows the seed of future sorrow. For this self-indulgence of the personality is a double sin against the real, a sin against the cleanliness of life, and a sin against the universal being, which permits no exclusive particular good, since, in the real, all spiritual possessions are held in common. This twofold sin brings its reaching punishment, its confining bondage to sorrow. But ceasing from self-indulgence brings purity, liberation, spiritual life. 51. There should be a complete overcoming of allurement or pride in the invitations of the different realms of life, lest attachment to things evil arise once more. The commentator tells us that disciples, seekers for union, are of 4 degrees. First, those who are entering the path. Second, those who are in the realm of allurements. Third, those who have won the victory over matter and the senses. Fourth, those who stand firm in pure spiritual life. To the second especially, the caution in the texts is addressed. More modern teachers would express the same truth by a warning against the delusions and fascinations of the psychic realm, which open around the disciple, as he breaks through into the unseen worlds. These are the dangers of the anteroom. Safety lies in passing on swiftly into the inner chamber. Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out. 52. From perfectly concentrated meditation on the divisions of time and their succession comes that wisdom which is born of discernment. The Upanishads say of the liberated that he has passed beyond the triad of time. He no longer sees life as projected into the past, present, and future, since these forms are of the mind, but beholds all things spread out in the quiet light of the eternal. This would seem to be the same thought, and to point to that clear-eyed spiritual perception which is above time, that wisdom born of the unveiling of time's delusion. Then shall the disciple live neither in the present nor in the future, but in the eternal. 53. Hence comes discernment between things which are of like nature, not distinguished by difference of kind, character, or position. Here, as also in the preceding sutra, we are close to the doctrine that distinctions of order, time, and space are creations of the mind, the threefold prism through which the real object appears to us distorted and refracted. When the prism is withdrawn, the object returns to its primal unity, no longer distinguishable by the mind, yet clearly knowable by that higher power of spiritual discernment, of illumination, which is above the mind. 54. The wisdom which is born of discernment is star-like. It discerns all things and all conditions of things. it discerns without succession simultaneously. That wisdom, that intuitive divining power is star-like, says the commentator, because it shines with its own light, because it rises on high, and illumines all things. Naught is hid from it, whether things past, things present, or things to come, for it is beyond the threefold form of time, so that all things are spread before it together, in the single light of the divine. This power has been beautifully described by Columba. Some there are, though very few, to whom divine grace has granted this, that they can clearly and most distinctly see, at one and at the same moment, as though under one ray of the sun, even the entire circuit of the whole world with its surroundings of ocean and sky, the inmost part of their mind being marvellously enlarged. 55. When the vesture and the spiritual man are alike pure, then the perfect spiritual life is attained. The vesture, says the commentator, must first be washed pure of all stains of passion and darkness, and the seeds of future sorrow must be burned up utterly. Then both the vesture and the wearer of the vesture being alike pure, the spiritual man enters into perfect spiritual life. End of Book 3. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. Voiceovers by Kirk.com.
Chapter 9 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Translated by Charles Johnston. Chapter 9. Introduction to Book 4. The third book of the Sutras has fairly completed the history of the birth and growth of the spiritual man, and the enumeration of his powers, at least so far as concerns that first epoch in his immortal life, which immediately succeeds and supersedes the life of the natural man. In the fourth book we are to consider what one might call the mechanism of salvation, the ideally simple working of cosmic law, which brings the spiritual man to birth, growth, and fullness of power, and prepares him for the splendid, toilsome further stages of his great journey home. The Sutras are here brief to obscurity. Only a few words, for example, are given to the great triune mystery and illusion of time. A phrase or two indicates the sweep of some universal law. Yet it is hoped that, by keeping our eyes fixed on the spiritual man, remembering that he is the hero of the story, and that all that is written concerns him and his adventures, we may be able to find our way through this thicket of tangled woods, and keep in our hands the clue to the mystery. The last part of the book needs little introduction. In a sense, it is the most important part of the whole treatise, since it unmasks the nature of the personality, that psychical mind which is the wakeful enemy of all who seek to tread the path. Even now we can hear it whispering the doubt whether that can be a good path, which thus sets mind at defiance. If this, then, be the most vital and fundamental part of the teaching, should it not stand at the very beginning? It may seem so at first, but had it stood there, we should have not comprehended it. For he who would know the doctrine must lead the life, doing the will of his Father, which is in heaven. End of Chapter 9. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 10 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Translated by Charles Johnston. Chapter 10. Book 4. 1. Psychic and spiritual powers may be inborn, or they may be gained by the use of drugs, or by incantations, or by fervor, or by meditation. Spiritual powers have been enumerated and described in the preceding sections. They are the normal powers of the spiritual man, the antitype, the divine edition of the powers of the natural man. Through these powers, the spiritual man stands, sees, hears, speaks in the spiritual world, as the physical man stands, sees, hears, speaks in the natural world. There is a counterfeit presentment of the spiritual man, in the world of dreams, a shadow lord of shadows, who has his own dreamy powers of vision, of hearing, of movement. He has left the natural without reaching the spiritual. He has set forth from the shore, but has not gained the further verge of the river. He is borne along by the stream, with no foothold on either shore. Leaving the actual, he has fallen short of the real, caught in the limbo of vanities and delusions. The cause of this aberrant phantasm is always the worship of a false, vain self, the lord of dreams, within one's own breast. This is the psychic man, lord of delusive and bewildering psychic powers. Spiritual powers, like intellectual or artistic gifts, may be inborn, the fruit, that is, of seeds planted and reared with toil in a former birth. So also the powers of the psychic man may be inborn, a delusive harvest from seeds of delusion. Psychical powers may be gained by drugs, as poverty, shame, debasement may be gained by the self-same drugs. In their action, they are baneful, cutting the man off from the consciousness of the restraining power of his divine nature, so that his forces break forth exuberant, like the laughter of drunkards, and he sees and hears things delusive. While sinking, he believes that he has risen. Growing weaker, he thinks himself full of strength. Beholding illusions, he takes them to be true. Such are the powers gained by drugs. They are wholly psychic, since the real powers, the spiritual, can never be so gained. Incantations are affirmations of half-truths concerning spirit and matters, what is and what is not, which work upon the mind and slowly build up a wraith of powers and a delusive well-being. These too are of the psychic realm of dreams. Lastly, there are the true powers of the spiritual man, built up and realized in meditation, through reverent obedience to spiritual law, to the pure conditions of being in the divine realm. 2. The transfer of powers from one venture to another comes through the flow of the natural creative forces. Here, if we can perceive it, is the whole secret of spiritual birth, growth, and life. Spiritual being, like all being, is but an expression of the self, of the inherent power and being of Atma. Inherent in the self are consciousness and will, which have as their lordly heritage the wide sweep of the universe throughout eternity. For the self is one with the eternal, and the consciousness of the self may make itself manifest as seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling, or whatever perceptive powers there may be. Just as the white sunlight may divide into many colored rays, so may the will of the self manifest itself in the uttering of words, or in handling, or in moving, and whatever powers of action there are throughout the seven worlds. Where the self is, there will its powers be. It is but a question of the vesture through which these powers shall shine forth. And wherever the consciousness and desire of the ever creative self are fixed, there will a vesture be built up. Where the heart is, there will the treasure be also. Since through ages the desire of the self has been toward the natural world, wherein the self sought to mirror himself that he might know himself, therefore a vesture of natural elements came unto being, through which blossomed forth the self's powers of perceiving and of will, the power to see, to hear, to speak, to walk, to handle. And when the self thus come to self-consciousness, and with it to a knowledge of his imprisonment, shall set his desire on the divine and real world,
and raise his consciousness thereto, the spiritual vesture shall be built up for him there, with its expression of his inherent powers. Nor will migration thither be difficult for the self, since the divine is no strange or foreign land for him, but the house of his home, where he dwells from everlasting. 3. The apparent, immediate cause is not the true cause of the creative nature powers, but like the husbandman in his field, it takes obstacles away. The husbandman tills his field, breaking up the clods of earth into fine mold, penetrable to air and rain. He sows his seed carefully, covering it for fear of birds and the wind. He waters the seed-laden earth, turning the little rills from the irrigation tank now this way and that, removing obstacles from the channels, until the even flow of water vitalizes the whole field. And so the plants germinate and grow, first the blade, then the ear, then the full corn in the ear. But it is not the husbandman who makes them grow. It is, first, the miraculous plasmic power in the grain of seed, which brings forth after its kind; then the alchemy of sunlight, which, in presence of the green coloring matter of the leaves, gathers hydrogen from the water and carbon from the gases in the air, and mingles them in the hydrocarbons of plant growth; and finally the wholly occult vital powers of the plant itself, stored up through ages, and flowing down from the primal sources of life. The husbandman but removes the obstacles. He plants and waters, but God gives the increase. So with the finer husbandman of diviner fields. He tills and sows, but the growth of the spiritual man comes through the surge and flow of divine creative forces and powers. Here, again, God gives the increase. The divine self puts forth, for the manifestation of its powers, a new and finer vesture, the body of the spiritual man. 4. Vestures of consciousness are built up in conformity with the Boston of the feeling of selfhood. The self, says a great teacher, in turn attaches itself to three vestures: first to the physical body, then to the finer body, and thirdly to the causal body. Finally it stands forth radiant, luminous, joyous as the self. When the self attributes itself to the physical body, there arises the states of bodily consciousness built up about the physical self. When the self, breaking through this first illusion, begins to see and feel itself in the finer body, to find selfhood there, then the states of consciousness of the finer body come into being, or to speak exactly, the finer body and its states of consciousness arise and grow together. But the self must not dwell permanently there. It must learn to find itself in the causal body, to build up the wide and luminous fields of consciousness that belong to that. Nor must it dwell forever there, for there remains the fourth state, the divine, with its own splendor and everlastingness. It is all a question of the states of consciousness, all a question of raising the sense of selfhood,
until it dwells forever in the eternal.
5. In the different fields of manifestation, the consciousness, though one, is the elective cause of many states of consciousness. Here is the splendid teaching of oneness that lies at the heart of the Eastern wisdom. Consciousness is ultimately one, everywhere and forever. The Eternal, the Father, is the one self of all beings, and so, in each individual who is but a facet of that self, consciousness is one. Whether it breaks through as the dull fire of physical life, or the murky flame of the psychic and passional, or the radiance of the spiritual man, or the full glory of the divine, it is ever the light, naught but the light. The one consciousness is the effective cause of all states of consciousness on every plane. 6. Among states of consciousness, that which is born of contemplation is free from the seed of future sorrow. Where the consciousness breaks forth in the physical body, and the full play of bodily life begins, its progression carries with it inevitable limitations. Birth involves death, meetings have their partings, hunger alternates with satiety, age follows on the heels of youth, so do the states of consciousness run along the circle of birth and death. With the psychic, the alternation between prize and penalty is swifter. Hope has its shadows of fear, or it is no hope. Exclusive love is tortured by jealousy. Pleasure passes through the deadness into pain. Pain's surcease brings pleasure back again. So here, too, the states of consciousness run their circle. In all psychic states there is egotism, which, indeed, is the very essence of the psychic, and where there is egotism, there is ever the seed of future sorrow. Desire carries bondage in its womb. But where the spiritual consciousness begins, free from self and stain, the ancient law of retaliation ceases, the penalty of sorrow lapses and is no more imposed. The soul now passes no longer from sorrow to sorrow, but from glory to glory. Its growth and splendor have no limit. The good passes to better, best. 7. The works of followers after union make neither for bright pleasure nor for dark pain. The works of others makes for pleasure or pain, or a mingling of these. The man of desire wins from his works the reward of pleasure, or incurs the penalty of pain, or, as so often happens in life, his guerdon, like the passionate mood of the lover, is part pleasure and part pain. Works done with self-seeking bear within them the seeds of future sorrow. Conversely, according to the proverb, present pain is future gain. But for him who has gone beyond desire, whose desire is set on the eternal, neither pain to be avoided nor pleasure to be gained inspires his work. He fears no hell, and desires no heaven. His one desire is to know the will of the Father and finish his work. He comes directly in line with the divine will, and works cleanly and immediately, without longing or fear. His heart dwells in the eternal. All his desires are set on the eternal. 8. From the force inherent in works comes the manifestation of those dynamic mind images which are conformable to the ripening out of each of these works. We are now to consider the general mechanism of karma, in order that we may pass on to the consideration of him who is free from karma. Karma, indeed, is the concern of the personal man, of his bondage or freedom. It is a succession of the forces which built up the personal man, reproducing themselves in one personality after another. Now let us take an imaginary case, to see how these forces may work out. Let us think of a man, with murderous intent in his heart, striking with a dagger at his enemy. He makes a red wound in his victim's breast. At the same instant he paints, in his own mind, a picture of that wound, a picture dynamic with all the fierce will power he has put into his murderous blow. In other words, he has made a deep wound in his own psychic body.
And when he comes to be born again, that body will become his outermost vesture,
Upon which, with its wound still there, bodily tissue will be built up. So the man will be born maimed, or with the predisposition to some mortal injury. He is unguarded at that point, and any trifling accidental blow will pierce the broken joints of his psychic armor. Thus do the dynamic mind images manifest themselves, coming to the surface, so that works done in the past may ripen and come to fruition. 9. Works separated by different nature, or place, or time, are brought together by the correspondence between memory and dynamic impression. Just as in the ripening out of mind images into bodily conditions, the effect is brought about by the ray of creative force sent down by the Self, somewhat as the light of the magic lantern projects the details of a picture on the screen, revealing the hidden and making secret things palpable and visible, so does this divine ray exercise a selective power on the dynamic mind images, bringing together into one day of life the seeds gathered from many days. The memory constantly exemplifies this power. A passage of poetry will call up in the mind like passages of many poets read at different times. So a prayer may call up many prayers. In like manner, the same overruling selective power, which is the ray of the higher self, gathers together from different births and times and places those mind images which are conformable, and may be grouped in the frame of a single life or a single event. Through this grouping, visible bodily conditions or outward circumstances are brought about, and by these the soul is taught and trained. Just as the dynamic mind images of desire ripen out in bodily conditions and circumstances, so the far more dynamic powers of aspiration, wherein the soul reaches toward the eternal, have their fruition in a finer world, building the vesture of the spiritual man. 10. The series of dynamic mind images is beginningless, because desire is everlasting. The whole series of dynamic mind images, which make up the entire history of the personal man, is a part of the mechanism which the self employs to mirror itself in a reflection, to embody its powers in an outward form, to the end of self expression, self realization, self knowledge. Therefore, the initial impulse behind these dynamic mind images comes from the self, and is the descending ray of the self, so that it cannot be said that there is any first member of the series of images from which the rest arose. The impulse is beginningless, since it comes from the self, which is from everlasting. Desire is not to cease, it is to turn to the eternal, and so become aspiration. 11. Since the dynamic mind images are held together by impulses of desire, by the wish for personal reward, by the substratum of mental habit, by the support of outer things desired, therefore, when they cease, the self-reproduction of dynamic mind images ceases. We are still concerned with the personal life in its bodily vesture, and with the process whereby the forces which have upheld it are gradually transferred to the life of the spiritual man, and build up for him his finer vesture in a finer world. How is the current to be changed? How is the flow of self-reproductive mind images, which have built the conditions of life after life in this world of bondage, to be checked, that the time of imprisonment may come to an end, the day of liberation dawn? The answer is given in the Sutra just translated. The driving force is withdrawn and directed to the upbuilding of the spiritual body. When the building impulses and forces are withdrawn, the tendency to manifest a new psychical body, a new body of bondage, ceases with them. 12. The differences between that which is past and that which is not yet come, according to their natures, depends on the difference of phase of their properties. Here we come to a high and difficult matter, which has always been held to be of great moment in the Eastern wisdom: the thought that the division of time into past, present, and future is in great measure an illusion, that past, present, future all dwell together in the eternal now. The discernment of this truth has been held to be so necessarily a part of wisdom, that one of the names of the enlightened is he who has passed beyond the three times, past, present, future. So the Western master said, "Before Abraham was, I am, and again, I am with you always, until the end of the world," using the eternal present for past and future alike. With the same purpose, the master speaks of himself as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And a master of our own days writes, "I feel even irritated at having to use these three clumsy words, past, present, and future, miserable concepts of the objective phases of the subjective whole. They are about as ill adapted for the purpose as an axe for fine carving. In the eternal now, both past and future are consummated." Björklund, the Swedish philosopher, has well stated the same truth. Neither past nor future can exist to God. He lives undividedly, without limitations, and needs not, as man, to plot out his existence in a series of moments. Eternity then is not identical with unending time. It is a different form of existence, related to time as the perfect to the imperfect. Man, as an entity for himself, must have the natural limitations for the part. Conceived by God, man is eternal in the divine sense, but conceived by himself, man's eternal life is clothed in the limitations we call time. The eternal is a constant present without beginning or end, without past or future. 13. The properties, whether manifest or latent, are of the nature of the three potencies. The three potencies are the three manifested modifications of the one primal material which stands opposite to perceiving consciousness. The three potencies are called substance, force, darkness, or viewed rather for their moral coloring, goodness, passion, inertness. Every material manifestation is a projection of substance into the empty space of darkness. Every mental state is either good or passional, or inert. So whether subjective or objective, latent or manifest, all things that present themselves to the perceiving consciousness are compounded of these three. This is a fundamental doctrine of the Sankhya system. 14. The external manifestation of an object takes place when the transformations are in the same phase. We should be inclined to express the same law by saying, for example, that a sound is audible when it consists of vibrations within the compass of the auditory nerve, that an object is visible when, either directly or by reflection, it sends forth luminiferous vibrations within the compass of the retina and the optic nerve. Vibrations below or above that compass make no impression at all, and the object remains invisible, as, for example, a kettle of boiling water in a dark room, though the kettle is sending forth heat vibrations closely akin to light. So, when the vibrations of the objects and those of the perceptive power are in the same phase, the external manifestation of the object takes place. There seems to be a further suggestion that the appearance of an object in the present, or its remaining hid in the past or future, is likewise a question of phase, and just as the range of vibrations perceived might be increased by the development of finer senses, so the perception of things past and things to come may be easy from a higher point of view. 15. The parts of material things and of states of consciousness are distinct, as is manifest from the fact that the same object may produce different impressions in different minds. Having shown that our bodily condition and circumstances depend on karma, while karma depends on perception and will, the sage recognizes the fact that from this may be drawn the false deduction that material things are in no wise different from states of mind. The same thought has occurred, and still occurs, to all philosophers, and by various reasonings they all come to the same wise conclusion, that the material world is not made by the mood of any human mind, but is rather the manifestation of the totally invisible being, whether we call this Mahat with the ancients or ether with the moderns. 16. Nor do material objects depend upon a single mind, for how could they remain objective to others if that mind ceased to think of them? This is but a further development of the thought of the preceding sutra, carrying on the thought that, while the universe is spiritual, yet its material expression is ordered, consistent, ruled by law, not subject to the whims or affirmations of a single mind. Unwelcome material things may be escaped by spiritual growth, by rising to a realm above them, and not by denying their existence on their own plane. So that our system is neither materialistic nor idealistic in the extreme sense, but rather intuitional and spiritual, holding that matter is the manifestation of spirit as a whole, a reflection or externalization of spirit, and, like spirit, everywhere obedient to law. The path of liberation is not through denial of matter, but through denial of wills of self, through obedience, and that aspiration which builds the vesture of the spiritual man. 17. An object is perceived, or not perceived, according as the mind is, or is not, tinged with the color of the object. The simplest manifestation of this is the matter of attention. Our minds apprehend what they wish to apprehend. All else passes unnoticed. Or, on the other hand, we perceive what we resent, as, for example, the noise of a passing train, while others, used to the sound, do not notice it at all. But the deeper meaning is that out of the vast totality of objects ever present in the universe, the mind perceives only those which conform to the hue of its karma. The rest remain unseen, even though close at hand. This spiritual law has been well expressed by Emerson. Through solidest eternal things the man finds his road as if they did not subsist, and does not once suspect their being. As soon as he needs a new object, suddenly he beholds it, and no longer attempts to pass through it, but takes another way. When he has exhausted for the time the nourishment to be drawn from any one person or thing, that object is withdrawn from his observation, and though still in his immediate neighborhood, he does not suspect its presence. Nothing is dead. Men feign themselves dead, and endure mock funerals and mournful obituaries, and there they stand looking out of the window, and sound and well, in some new and strange disguise. Jesus is not dead. He is very well alive. Nor John, nor Paul, nor Mohammed, nor Aristotle. At times we believe we have seen them all, and could easily tell the names under which they go. 18. The movements of the psychic nature are perpetually objects of perception, since the spiritual man, who is the lord of them, remains unchanging. Here is teaching of the utmost import, both for understanding and for practice. To the psychic nature belong all the ebb and flow of emotion, all hoping and fearing, desire and hate, the things that make the multitude of men and women deem themselves happy or miserable. To it also belong the measuring and comparing, the doubt and questioning, which, for the same multitude, make up mental life, so that there results the emotion-soaked personality, with its dark and narrow view of life, the shivering, terror-driven personality that is life itself for all but all of mankind. Yet the personality is not the true man, nor the living soul at all, but only a spectacle which the true man observes. Let us understand this, therefore, and draw ourselves up inwardly to the height of the spiritual man, who, standing in the quiet light of the eternal, looks down serene upon this turmoil of the outer life. One first masters the personality, the mind, by thus looking down on it from above, from within, by steadily watching its ebb and flow, as objective, outward, and therefore not the real self. This standing back is the first step, detachment. The second, to maintain the vantage ground thus gained, is recollection. 19. The mind is not a self-luminous, since it can be seen as an object. This is a further step toward overthrowing the tyranny of the mind, the psychic nature of emotion and mental measuring. This psychic self, the personality, claims to be absolute, asserting that life is for it, and through it. It seeks to impose on the whole being of man its narrow, materialistic, faithless view of life and the universe. It would clip the wings of the soaring soul. But the soul dethrones the tyrant by perceiving and steadily affirming that the psychic self is no true self at all, not self-luminous, but only an object of observation, watched by the serene eyes of the spiritual man. 20. Nor could the mind at the same time know itself and things external to it. The truth is that the mind knows neither external things nor itself. Its measuring and analyzing its hoping and fearing, hating and desiring, never give it a true measure of life, nor any sense of real values. Ceaselessly active, it never really attains to knowledge, or, if we admit its knowledge, it ever falls short of wisdom, which comes only through intuition, the vision of the spiritual man. Life cannot be known by the mind. Its secrets cannot be learned through the mind. The proof is the ceaseless strife and contradiction of opinion among those who trust in the mind. Much less can the mind know itself, the more so because it is pervaded by the illusion that it truly knows, truly is. True knowledge of the mind comes first when the spiritual man, arising, stands detached, regarding the mind from above with quiet eyes, and seeing it for the tangled web of psychic forces that it truly is. But the truth is divined long before it is clearly seen, and then begins the long battle of the mind against the real, the mind fighting doggedly, craftily for its supremacy. 21. If the mind be thought of as seen by another more inward mind, then there would be an endless series of perceiving minds and a confusion of memories. One of the expedients by which the mind seeks to deny and thwart the soul, when it feels that it is beginning to be circumvented and seen through, is to assert that this seeing is the work of a part of itself, one part observing the other, and thus leaving no need nor place for the spiritual man. To this strategy the argument is opposed by our philosopher, that this would be no true solution, but only a postponement of the solution, for we should have to find yet another part of the mind to view the first observing part, and then another to observe this, and so on, endlessly. The true solution is that the spiritual man looks down upon the psychic nature, and observes it. When he views the psychic pictures gallery, this is memory, which would be a hopeless, inextricable confusion if we thought of one part of the mind with its memories viewing another part with memories of its own. The solution of the mystery lies not in the mind, but beyond it, in the luminous life of the risen Lord, the spiritual man. 22. When the psychical nature takes on the form of the spiritual intelligence, by reflecting it, then the self becomes conscious of its own spiritual intelligence. We are considering a stage of spiritual life at which the psychical nature has been cleansed and purified. Formerly it reflected in its plastic substance the images of the earthy. Purified now, it reflects the image of the heavenly, giving the spiritual intelligence a visible form. The self, beholding that visible form, in which its spiritual intelligence has, as it were, taken palpable shape, thereby reaches self-recognition, self-comprehension. The self sees itself in this mirror, and thus becomes not only conscious but self-conscious. This is, from one point of view, the purpose of the whole evolutionary process. 23. The psychic nature, taking on the color of the seer and of things seen, leads to the perception of all objects. In the unregenerate man, the psychic nature is saturated with images of material things, of things seen or heard, or tasted or felt, and this web of dynamic images from the ordinary material and driving power of life. The sensation of sweet things tasted clamors to be renewed, and drives the man into effort to obtain its renewal. So he adds image to image, each dynamic and importunate, piling up sin's intolerable burden. Then comes regeneration, and the washing away of sin through the fiery, creative power of the soul, which burns out the stains of the psychic vesture, purifying it as gold is refined in the furnace. The suffering of regeneration springs from this indispensable purifying. Then the psychic vesture begins to take on the color of the soul, no longer stained, but suffused with golden light, and the man red generate gleams with a radiant of eternity. Thus the spiritual man puts on fair raiment, for of this cleansing it is said, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be as crimson, they shall be as wool. 24. The psychic nature, which has been printed with mind images of innumerable material things, exists now for the spiritual man, building for him. The mind, once the tyrant, is now the slave, recognized as outward, separate, not self, a well-trained instrument of the spiritual man. For it is not ordained for the spiritual man that, finding his higher realm, he shall enter altogether there, and pass out of the vision of mankind. It is true that he dwells in heaven, but he also dwells on earth. He has angels and archangels, the hosts of the just made perfect, for his familiar friends, but he has at the same time found a new kinship with the prone children of men, who stumble and sin in the dark. Finding sinlessness, he finds also that the world's sin and shame are his, not to share, but to atone. Finding kinship with angels, he likewise finds his part in the toil of angels, the toil for the redemption of the world. For this work, he who now stands in the heavenly realm needs his instrument on earth, and this instrument he finds ready to his hand, and fitted and perfected by the very struggles he has waged against it. In the personality, the mind of the personal man, this once tyrant is now his servant and perfect ambassador, bearing witness before men of heavenly things, and even in this present world doing the will and working the works of the Father. 25. For him who discerns between the mind and the spiritual man, there comes perfect fruition of the longing after the real being of the self. How many times in the long struggle have the soul's aspirations seemed but a hopeless, impossible dream, a madman's counsel of perfection? Yet every finest, most impossible aspiration shall be realized, and 10 times more than realized, once the long arduous fight against the mind and the mind's world view is won. And then it will be seen that unfaith and despair were but weapons of the mind to daunt the soul, and put off the day when the neck of the mind shall be put under the foot of the soul. Have you aspired, well nigh hopeless, after immortality? You shall be paid by entering the immortality of God. Have you aspired in misery and pain, after consoling, healing love? You shall be made a dispenser of the divine love of God Himself to weary souls. Have you sought ardently, in your day of feebleness, after power? You shall wield power, immortal, infinite, with God working the works of God. Have you, in lonely darkness, longed for companionship and consolation? You shall have angels and archangels for your friends, and all the immortal hosts of the dawn. These are the fruits of victory, therefore overcome. These are the prizes of regeneration, therefore die to self, that you may rise again to God. 26. Thereafter, the whole personal being bends toward illumination, toward eternal life. This is part of the secret of the soul, that the salvation means not merely that a soul shall be cleansed and raised to heaven, but that the whole realm of the natural powers shall be redeemed, building up, even in this present world, the kingly figure of the spiritual man. The traditions of the ages are full of his footsteps, majestic, uncomprehended shadows, myths, demigods, fill the memories of all the nobler peoples. But the time cometh when he shall be known no longer demigod, nor myth, nor shadow, but the ever-present Redeemer, working amid men for the life and cleansing of all souls. 27. In the internals of the batik, other thoughts will arise through the impressions of the dynamic mind images. The battle is long and arduous. Let there be no mistake as to that. Go not forth to this battle without counting the cost. Ages have gone to the strengthening of the foe. Ages of conflict must be spent ere the foe, wholly conquered, becomes the servant, the soul's minister to mankind. And from these long past ages, in hours when the contest flags, will come new foes, mind-born children springing up to fight for mind, reinforcements coming from forgotten years, forgotten lives. For once this conflict is begun, it can be ended only by sweeping victory and unconditional, unreserved surrender of the vanquished. 28. These are to be overcome as it was taught that hindrances should be overcome. These new enemies and fears are to be overcome by ceaselessly renewing the fight, by a steadfast, dogged persistence, whether in victory or defeat, which shall put the stubbornness of the rocks to shame. For the soul is older than all things and invincible. It is of the very nature of the soul to be unconquerable. Therefore fight on, undaunted, knowing that the spiritual will, once awakened, shall, through the effort of the contest, come to its full strength. That ground gained can be held permanently. That, great as is the dead weight of the adversary, it is yet measurable, while the warrior who fights for you, for whom you fight, is in might immeasurable, invincible, everlasting. 29. He who, after he has attained, is wholly free from self, reaches the essence of all that can be known, gathered together like a cloud. This is the true spiritual consciousness. It has been said that, at the beginning of the way, we must kill out ambition, the great curse, the giant weed which grows as strongly in the heart of the devoted disciple as in the man of desire. The remedy is sacrifice of self-obedience, humility, the purity of heart which gives the vision of God. Thereafter, he who has attained is wrapped about with the essence of all that can be known, as with a cloud. He has that perfect illumination which is the true spiritual consciousness. Through obedience to the will of God, he comes into oneness of being with God. He is initiated into God's view of the universe, seeing all life as God sees it. 30. Thereon comes surcease from sorrow and the burden of toil. Such a one, it is said, is free from the bond of karma, from the burden of toil, from that debt to works which comes from works done in self-love and desire. Free from self-will, he is free from sorrow. Too, for sorrow comes from the fight of self-will against the divine will, through the correcting stress of the divine will, which seeks to counteract the evil wrought by disobedience. When the conflict with the divine will ceases, then sorrow ceases, and he who has grown into obedience thereby enters into joy. 31. When all veils are rent, all stains washed away, his knowledge becomes infinite. Little remains for him to know. The first veil is the delusion that thy soul is in some permanent way separate from the great Soul, the divine eternal. When that veil is rent, thou shalt discern thy oneness with everlasting life. The second veil is the delusion of enduring separateness from thy other selves, whereas in truth the soul that is in them is one with the soul that is in thee. The world's sin and shame are thy sin and shame, its joy also. These veils rent, thou shalt enter into knowledge of divine things and human things. Little will remain unknown to thee. 32. Thereafter comes the completion of the series of transformations of the three nature potencies, since their purpose is attained. It is a part of the beauty and wisdom of the great Indian teachings, the Vedanta and the Yoga alike, to hold that all life exists for the purposes of soul, for the making of the spiritual man. They teach that all nature is an orderly process of evolution, leading up to this, designed for this end, existing only for this, to bring forth and perfect the spiritual man. He is the crown of evolution. At his coming, the goal of all development is attained. 33. The series of transformations is divided into moments. When the series is completed, time gives place to duration. There are two kinds of eternity, says the commentary: the eternity of immortal life, which belongs to the spirit, and the eternity of change, which inherits in nature, in all that is not spirit. While we are content to live in and for nature, in the circle of necessity, sansar, we doom ourselves to perpetual change. That which is born must die, and that which dies must be reborn. It is change evermore, a ceaseless series of transformations. But the spiritual man enters a new order. For him there is no longer eternal change, but eternal being. He has entered into the joy of his Lord. This spiritual birth, which makes him heir of the everlasting, sets a term to change. It is the culmination, the crowning transformation of the whole realm of change. 34. Pure spiritual life is, therefore, the inverse resolution of the potencies of nature, which have emptied themselves of their value for the spiritual man, or it is the return of the power of pure consciousness to its essential form. Here we have a splendid generalization in which our wise philosopher finally reconciles the naturalists and the idealists, expressing the crown and end of his teaching, first in the terms of the naturalist, and then in the terms of the idealist. The birth and growth of the spiritual man, and his entry into his immortal heritage, may be regarded, says our philosopher, either as the culmination of the whole process of natural evolution and involution, where that which flowed from out the boundless deep turns again home, or it may be looked at, as the Vedantins looked at it, as the restoration of pure spiritual consciousness to its pristine and essential form. There is no discrepancy or conflict between these two views, which are but two accounts of the same thing. Therefore, those who study the wise philosopher, be they naturalist or idealist, have no excuse to linger over dialectic subtleties or disputes. These things are lifted from their path, lest they should be tempted to delay over them, and they are left facing the path itself, stretching upward and onward from their feet to the everlasting hills, radiant with infinite light. End of chapter 10. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. End of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, translated by Charles Johnston.